Hey everybody. I know it's been a while, but I thought that I would do a couple videos and get them uploaded before I start class again. So here we go. Hold on for a second. Let me. Okay, I don't even know. Okay, there's no music on this one. Um, the FBI has a world-class code breaking team. Basically, their job is to decode encrypted evidence. So imagine coming across a piece of evidence, this ain't the Zodiac, that appears to have secret message embedded inside of it. It's the job of the brainiacs on the decoding team to go in there and figure out what those secret messages are. Now, this decoding team is incredibly good, but periodically they do run into riddles, if you will, that are just way too difficult and they can't figure them out. When this happens, they often appeal to the public and say, hey, anybody out there can solve this? Let us know if you can solve this riddle. So today's story involves one of those types of impossible riddles. And if you stay to the end of the video, you will actually see the mystifying evidence. I'll show you where you need to go online, literally, to help the FBI solve the riddle if you can. Um, Okay, we're going to start with spy stuff. No, this is Ricky McCormick. This is I'm going to show you later. In a bigger picture. Um, on June 25th, 1999, around 5 o'clock in the evening, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, where his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe, and said that he had asthma. And earlier that day, he had been cutting grass. So maybe that was the cause that caused it to flare up. But either way, he was in a lot of discomfort, saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and his whole life he had heart and lung problems. And so, him arriving at the state, this kind of state in the ER wasn't actually, uncommon for him. So, at this hospital, what they did was anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe, they immediately took Ricky back to the exam room and they hooked him up to all these monitors. This was actually the hospital that he went to, by the way. They hooked him up to the monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up to, he started acting really agitated and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. He was sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quietly no one could understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed that his it was beating and his oxygen levels were perfect. The doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he had clearly saw that something was off about Ricky. There was um, no sign that they're, like physically wrong with him. So the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on had to be psychological. And it happened that Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. be odd if I couldn't say that word, issues. He was known for making up things all the time, just telling people crazy stories about himself, like that he was a talented singer and that he was about to go on tour, and he was a prince. I think maybe he didn't get that whole story together. Um, and that he was studying to be a doctor. Excuse me. I mean, things that nobody thought were true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge. This is who I am. And so Ricky's family, for the longest time, just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both very serious mental disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends to get help, never went to get any psychological help for his issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school, not going back to any sort of schooling. He had spent time in jail. Now Ricky was living in a low income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which was the Midwestern city of Mississippi, on the Mississippi River, that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had nowhere else to go and no way to leave the St. Louis area. In fact, Ricky did not even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place to his aunt's to his girlfriend's. Um, Ricky did not work, but the work was, he did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was mostly part time, just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking and drinking, literally gallons of coffee back to back. So back to the ER. Hold on, I'm drink. Ricky was still in the exam room. He had only been there for less than a half an hour when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to now discharge him. Ricky immediately said, "No, no, I have to stay here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me." But the doctor just kind of ignored what he had said and handed him the discharge paper. 15 minutes later, when the nurse came back in to the exam room to get the paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and still see Ricky sitting on the exam bed, kind of fiddling around, looking down at his paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked up to Ricky, he looked up and at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, "I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me?" So the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got on these dirty clothes. He looks frail, clearly very down on his luck. And there was some mental issues happening with this guy. And he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, "No problem." She sat down with him and together they filled out the paperwork. And then afterwards, she walked out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital and she took Ricky. Ricky turned to her and said, "Instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight?" And the nurse knew she was not allowed to do this. She looked around and saw it was not a busy night. Oh, there's his cigarettes he was smoking. There's his discharge papers. Time to time, the emergency room lobby. Okay. And she said, "It's okay, I'm gonna bother nobody. You can stay here." And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly and then walked over to the corner that was kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door. He sat down and folded his arms and just stared at the front door. So the nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on how he came in and he was acting. So she figured, he needs a warm place to stay tonight. So the nurse went back to her station. Over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky curled up asleep in the corner. But every time that she looked out, Ricky was still sitting up with his arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital as if he was expecting somebody to come in at any moment and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene, just to let him be and do his thing. Later that morning at 11:30, when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew comes on. The nurses come in, and right away, they noticed Ricky was sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. When they walked up to him to ask him, "Are you okay? What are you doing? Is there anything we can do to help you?" Ricky, instead of trying to talk to them, he stands up and just walks out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, of course, why you wouldn't. But she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And when she asked him, "Are you okay? What's going on, Ricky?" He would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital, but he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the hospital in the lobby. She, I guess, assumed that he was admitted as a patient. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was a raising red flags for her, because this was actually the second time that week that he had gone to the ER. Just a few days earlier, he was released from the different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors that he had chest pains and that he couldn't breathe. Okay, this is not in my notes, but this was the same where he worked. We'll get there, but this is the second hospital that he actually was in that week, or within a week. And he had been admitted for a couple days, but ultimately they determined that there was really nothing wrong with him, and they too believed whatever was going on with him was psychological. So he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks he had begun acting really paranoid to the point where anytime he was in his apartment and somebody outside just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump up as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, "What's going on? Why are you so paranoid?" He refused to elaborate. So his feelings were very concerned. She had feelings that were very concerning about Ricky on the phone. And whenever he called her that day, and Sandy asked him, "Would you like to come by the apartment and let me take care of you? If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just come, please come by the apartment right now." But Ricky said no, that he didn't want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to be walking to the nearby gas station. Now, that's where the gas station comes in, but you'll see in a minute, it also said that he worked there some, so I don't know. To a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat. Then afterwards, he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up, but Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come by the gas station and got a hot dog on the 26th. And on the next day, the 27th, the same worker said that he'd come by again and he had got a bite to eat. But then he left after that. Nobody saw Ricky, not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in no other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared on June 30th. So 3 days after Ricky was last seen at the gas station, a woman was driving her car. Hold on, let me get to that. There's the store. A woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on the highway when she looked off into a cornfield, but that butted up against the highway and saw some kind of object in the middle of the cornfield that was dark shaped. She was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over um, on the road. She got out and began walking towards the object in the cornfield to see what it was. When she got up to it, she saw what it was. She froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, ran back to her car, and then she flew to the nearest gas station. She grabbed a payphone and she called 911. When the police arrived at the cornfield, they too walked towards the dark thing, and then finally they saw, if it ain't phone, it's notifications. They saw what was this thing that had scared the woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down. Their body was very decomposed, and in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart, like their fingers falling off. I mean, like crumpling off their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be a male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the event's decomposition, authorities were able to get good fingerprints, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say that they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along the highway, this cornfield, was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself because he didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There were no public transportations that could have brought him there. If Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive just 3 days earlier. And the theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and kept indoors in the heat and then had it accelerated, like the decomposition. And at the same point, whoever killed him had moved his body and dumped it in the cornfield. So on the first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives on the case. They also appealed to the public to come forward if they had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police come out and made an announcement that knowing that after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but must have instead just died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, so this is probably likely what killed him. So they closed the case, and soon after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up and put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. And 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), one of the alphabet boys, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri, about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals. And a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer, but they did not know really what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow, and it didn't make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big time drug dealer, who is really a mover and shaker in St. Louis, get involved with a guy like this, Ricky McCormick, who's obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could he play for this drug dealer? But the FBI did follow up on the tip because it seemed very credible. And when they spoke to the local police, they investigated Ricky's death. They got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence. And immediately, the FBI realized the local police overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange piece of evidence was quickly sent to the FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of the forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so he received this piece of evidence. He got to work on it right away to try to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer. Maybe it does, maybe it answers the question of how many people are connected. But despite his best efforts of calling in experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure it out. What it meant. At the same time, Dan was doing this. The big drug dealer was a target of the FBI investigation in St. Louis, and he was arrested on a gun and drug charges. So the big case was now over, and suddenly trying to figure out the connection between Ricky McCormick to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was dead. So the FBI put it on pause. Um, they put it on pause trying to figure out what this evidence was. So Dan, even though he was really curious, now he was fully invested and was trying to figure out what this thing was. He realized he had to give it up to and move on to something else. So the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everybody was just they moved on from the Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. And 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become a very senior FBI agent. He was actually in charge of crypto analysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning that there were people that would pull out any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And some point after that, taking over the unit, Dan pulled out the storage, this strange piece of evidence that was connected to Ricky McCormick. And he said, what I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to, it's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked them to take a look at the piece of mystifying evidence and came forward and come forward if you have any ideas of what this means. When Ricky was discovered in the cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets, and in his pants pocket were two documents that contained an incredible complex cipher or code It is basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye, but to the people like Dan and his code-breaking team, seems that symbols and letters could mean a secret message hidden inside of the documents. If you could break the code system, but of course, no one could ever break it or figure it out. So, how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill. And okay, I'm gonna say right now, that's what I thought. I thought he was probably writing some gibberish, but I'm not absolutely sure on it when I seen it. He's not in touch with reality all the time. How does a guy like this come into possession of a complex cipher? And if he didn't write these ciphers, um, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave it to him. And why would anyone who came up with these very complex ciphers entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably they contain confidential information that's very that's being very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And he also what happened to Ricky in the cornfield. I mean, I don't even know how he got there or how he was killed. We all know all we do know, sorry, is that he had the ciphers in his pockets when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to the drug lord in St. Louis, if any, um, or what could be solved out of it, like if there was maybe names or something like that. We can just figure out what these two ciphers are, but of right now, it's not been solved. A couple weeks before he died, he became increasingly paranoid and was scared of someone or something that he said, likely running into hospitals, and eventually whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of may have caught up with him. Until we've cracked the ciphers, it's very likely we will have no actual idea of what happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI set up a special website where you can go and look at these two ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket. And if you're able to um, crack them or know anything, then send it to the FBI. Help solve Ricky's murder, to go out to the FBI website, click the link that's going to be below, and it will take you to it. And I appreciate you sticking with me. Thank you. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, all that good shit. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and just look at these. And when you go on the website, obviously it's going to be, a lot better. So this is this was a screenshot. This is a real messy one. So we'll go on to the website in a minute. This was the second one. And I'm thinking that maybe this is some of it. I don't know. This was Ricky McCormick. Okay. Gosh, where I got the gas station thing from. Okay, this is the first page of it. I'm gonna leave it sit here for just a second so you can look at it, screenshot it, whatever you wanna do. I'm also gonna put the link for the FBI thing down in the description. This was the second one. Okay, so this is the story. Oh my God, what the hell is over here on the corner of my? This was the story of Ricky McCormick. It's very sad and distressing because one, you got this cryptic note that notes that you want to figure out, but at the same time, this man has lost his life. Was it mental illness? Was there really somebody that was chasing him? I mean, you know, who knows? And maybe if we can figure out what the message is, then we can figure out what's going on. Or maybe one day the criminal will talk. But until then, thank you for joining me. Like, subscribe, comment, complain, concerns, all that good stuff. Let me know. But thank you again for joining me, and I will see you next time. Bye.